Now for a broader look into economic ties between the US and the EU, I'm joined by Michael Kimmage. He's a Transatlantic Academy Fellow for the German Marshall Fund and a history professor at Catholic University of America. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So from President Trump's very warm three-day state visit with French President Emmanuel Macron to this very short, seemingly terse visit with German Chancellor Angela Merkel, how do you think the US will balance these individual ties when it really has to deal with the EU as a whole?
Well, I'm not sure that there's an evident strategy on the part of the Trump administration for that. He has a personal style of rule, and he likes to deal with countries individually. So sequential meetings probably suit him just fine, but I don't see behind that any real strategy for dealing with the EU. So I suspect he's going to have to improvise in that area.
Now let's look at some of the things that he discussed with Merkel. You had global security, trade, and of course the Iran nuclear deal. How much closer did Merkel and Trump get to any sort of consensus on these issues?
I don't think they got an inch closer to consensus on any of these issues. What you can say is, compared to the visit roughly a year ago, that it was much friendlier. Trump did shake hands with Chancellor Merkel, which didn't occur last time and led to a kind of mini scandal. So in terms of personal relations, I think it went as well as these visits can go, but there was no tangible result. I don't think that Trump yielded, and I don't think anybody expected Chancellor Merkel to come to Washington and to soften her position. So they were where they were before the meeting.
So let's get an idea of where the US stands in terms of its economic relationship with the EU. How would you describe that?
It's a massively important relationship for the United States. It constitutes the major trade partner for the United States, but there is, of course, a deficit, as President Trump is very much aware, where the United States imports more than it exports to the EU. And if you look specifically at Germany, that export imbalance is at its most extreme.
And how did it get to that point of having such a huge trade imbalance with the US?
I think it has to do with the nature of the economies, the kinds of things that the United States produces, the kinds of services that it offers, and the complementary services on the part of the EU. I don't think that this was a policy decision on either side. It's a kind of economic consequence of what these two trading blocs are.
Now, one thing they did look at, this concept of a bilateral trade deal between the US and the EU. Now, Merkel did say she was open to it, but she also highlighted some of the shortcomings when it comes to the WTO and how they handle multilateral trade deals. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, that's true. The WTO is not well set up to deal with that, and I really wonder whether the Trump administration has the wherewithal to carry through on something. It's understaffed in a number of areas, and it just has not put forward an EU-wide strategy. Trump continues to speak as if he would prefer to deal bilaterally, and yet that would not work from the EU side of things. So it's really hard to know how Trump could accomplish some of the aims he's articulated.
And obviously, one of the sticking points is when the EU found itself brought into President Trump's spotlight on trade tariffs with steel and aluminium in the US's trade dispute with China. So to what degree are these tariffs considered a test of the US-EU trade relationship?
I think that's absolutely the case. It's possible that they could prove a bit more symbolic than deeply economic. That would suit Trump's style in some ways. He likes to have dramatic gestures, and that could qualify in this case, but very often in these kinds of situations you get reciprocal consequences. So the EU is going to be obligated to respond, and then as with American disputes with China at the moment, there's a sort of action-counter-action dynamic, and that may be what Chancellor Merkel was really here to talk about, that she wasn't going to prevent Trump from doing anything, but she probably is eager to mitigate the consequences of a potential trade war.
And this trade situation does have a lot of countries kind of jockeying and perhaps looking for alternatives. So what sort of opportunities then could there be for China, as we know that this May 1st deadline is coming up about these exemptions? Could there be then potential opportunities between China and the EU if things deteriorate between the US?
I think there's no question about that. I mean, I think it was of symbolic importance that the EU consolidated a trade deal with Mexico this week at the same time that relations with the United States are rocky. And as the United States proves a difficult country to read, and to a degree a difficult country to work with, I think it's by definition an opportunity for China.
All right, thank you so much. Michael Kimmage there, Transatlantic Academy Fellow at the German Marshall Fund.